This is CBN NewsWatch.
Thanks for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Mark Martin. A developing story out of Washington today, a suspicious substance at the Pentagon, and out of Texas at the office of Senator Ted Cruz. We go now to CBN's national security expert, Eric Rosales. Eric, what can you tell us about the Pentagon first?
Well, Mark, as we know right now, I have confirmed through my Pentagon sources that white powdery substance was actually sent in 2 envelopes to the Pentagon Force Protection Agency. Now, that is a separate building, but is still connected by way of the Pentagon. All the mail actually does go through there and gets proper screening before it actually goes inside the Pentagon. And sources tell me that 2 pieces of mail actually tested initially positive for ricin. Ricin is a highly toxic compound that's extracted from the castor bean and has been used in terror plots before. And if it's actually ingested into your body, it could cause death. It could also be inhaled into your body. So as of right now, the FBI has been called in and the pieces of mail have been taken out of that area after the area was evacuated. Now, over in Houston, Texas, we understand that 2 people have been taken from Senator Ted Cruz's office. These 2 people have been rushed to the hospital after they were exposed to a white powdery substance. The mail was actually sent to the Phoenix Tower office building located at 3200 Southwest Freeway. And according to Houston Fire Department, 2 people were exposed to a white powdery substance. We don't know their condition right now, but that's the very latest. Mark, back to you.
All right, Eric, thank you for that report. And we know that you'll keep us updated on CBNnews.com.
Will do.
President Donald Trump told reporters everywhere he goes the American people are for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, and he believes Kavanaugh will be confirmed. One of the 3 women accusing Kavanaugh is backtracking on some of her claims. Here with more is Robert Donachie with the Washington Examiner. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, what is the latest with Julie Swetnick and an NBC interview?
So as we know, Swetnick is the 3rd accuser of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. She claims to have seen Kavanaugh and his friend Mark Judge spike the punch at high school parties in the early 1980s in order to get women inebriated to the point that they can't say no, a very damning claim. Now, last night in an NBC interview, she walked that back, saying that she never really directly saw Kavanaugh actually put anything in the punch, just that she was around the bowl. And so that walk back is actually causing some people to question whether or not her story is valid.
Do you think the FBI will still interview her?
I think that, the White House has given a pretty broad mandate to the FBI, so long as they can meet the quick, expedited 1-week FBI investigation, and as Trump said yesterday, they can interview just about everybody they want. One important thing to note is that this investigation was launched last Friday in order to get to the bottom of Ford's allegations, not necessarily Swetnick's or the other accusers.
Do you think the investigation will go fast and there will be a vote this week?
Well, so I think, the writing's on the wall here. Mitch McConnell has said that he wants the vote to come this week. It's backed up by Republican leadership, and the president wants the quick, expedited investigation and a close to this. I think really what you have to focus on is McConnell is really focused on 3 people, Murkowski, Collins, and Flake. And so I'd say that at any time that he has 2 out of the 3 of them locked down, we will see a vote as quickly as possible.
What are your thoughts about the president's statements today that the American people, wherever he goes, they are for Judge Brett Kavanaugh? Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think conservatives and conservative groups have been behind Brett Kavanaugh 100%. I think that many people who see Brett Kavanaugh as an accomplished judge, as somebody who's a conservative stalwart and somebody that would push forth their agenda on the Supreme Court are not, I guess, detoured at all in their support for him by these allegations. Now, if the allegations came forth with some kind of evidence that these truly did happen, rather than kind of the he said, she said that we're seeing right now, maybe you'll see that back off. But in the conversations I've had with conservative groups, conservatives and Republicans, it doesn't seem like they've lost any of their, gumption for Kavanaugh at this point.
What about the other side of the aisle? Any chance maybe some independents coming out in support of Kavanaugh?
I think time will tell at that fact. I mean, I'd say right now you probably have about 50 senators on the Republican side, are close to 49 to 50. So again, it's going to all come down to Collins, Murkowski, and Flake.
Okay, well, let's talk about an article you've written for the Examiner tying the outcome of this confirmation and the November elections.
All right, so I spoke with conservative Republican strategists and I spoke with Democratic strategists over the past 5 days regarding actually how does this play out in the midterms. Now, the ubiquitous stance on Republicans and the Democratic side is that Republicans in Congress will face serious blowback, could possibly lose both chambers of Congress if they don't get Kavanaugh through this week or next week. Now, I've got a couple conservative strategists who told me that, Republicans shouldn't even bother to show up to work on November 7th if they can't get this done. I think the overarching message I got from Democrats is that you couldn't even write an article about how many mistakes that Republicans made along this process, that you would need to write a book, that they feel that, Republicans once again alienated women in this process. They did so when questioning Ford. They did so basically, throughout this entire time. So what I do see is that, Republicans have a real shot here that if they can't get Kavanaugh through, they could really lose the House and possibly the Senate.
All right, Robert Donachie with the Washington Examiner. Thanks for your insights, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Some good news out of Washington when it comes to the unborn and families. The House passed a bill that would allow for the funding of a 529 education savings plan for babies in the womb. David Christensen with the Family Research Council's Government Affairs Office is here to tell us more. Welcome, David. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Tell us about this provision in the tax code which recognized the unborn.
Well, it would be the first time that in the IRS code, a child would include an unborn child. And a provision was added to the Family Savings Act. Representative Mike Kelly sponsored that bill to expand education accounts, as you said, 529 education accounts for dependents. And that would include children, including an unborn child. So that would let parents, for instance, start a 529 education account when they're pregnant. It would allow grandparents to contribute into a 529 education savings account if their children, if they discovered, hey, we're going to be grandparents. So it's really a pro-life policy from the standpoint of the tax code. It recognizes the child as an unborn child. And one interesting thing to know, this really is not an anti-abortion provision. This is really just a pro-life, and it is a pro-family. It allows parents and grandparents to start earlier for their kids' education.
There's also good news related to adoptions, I understand. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, good question. There's another provision in the bill that this bill would effectively allow parents to take out of their retirement accounts early, penalty-free if it was for newborn children or adoptive kids. So it's, again, a very pro-family piece of legislation. Right now, if you take your retirement money out, you'll get really clobbered by Uncle Sam taking that out of your retirement accounts early. This would allow parents to do that if they have newborn children or adopted kids. It's very pro-adoption, pro-child, pro-family. This is something that we at FRC strongly support, and I think pro-family and pro-life individuals around the country can really rally behind.
Tell us what it does for homeschoolers, the bill.
Well, that's a good question, too. In the tax reform package that became law last December, that President Trump signed into law, there was an effort to expand education accounts, these 529 accounts, to include not only public and private schools for K through 12, but also homeschoolers. Unfortunately, that provision didn't make it, the provision on homeschooling didn't make it through the Senate process. But it did include parochial K through 12 schools. This bill that the House just passed would include homeschool children. That way, it's not biasing federal tax policy towards private schools or public schools or homeschooling. It gives all parents an equal opportunity to use those kinds of accounts for the education of their children. This is again a very great piece of legislation from a pro-family, pro-education standpoint.
David, is this part of more tax reform and tax breaks for Americans? What else is part of this bill or in the works?
Well, this was one of three bills that the House just passed, sent it over to the Senate. As you've already discussed, the Senate's pretty busy right now with the nomination process, but may take up a tax bill. The other tax bill that I think people would be interested in is it permanently extended the individual tax rate reductions that last year's tax reform package put into effect. I think it was 8 years that the lower tax rates, individual rates, because of budget costs, this bill would actually make them permanent. And 10 Democrats, I think, voted for it. Republicans voted for it. We'll see if the Senate takes it up. This is another pro-growth, pro-family type of policy. And then the third bill was business innovation. That bill passed as well, letting small businesses basically get better tax breaks so that they can innovate, create more jobs, and help our economy.
And quickly, back to the first bill, remind our viewers of the name of it and how you think it'll do in the Senate.
It's a Family Savings Act. That's Representative Kelly's bill. I think it's a bill that the Senate could pass. There certainly might be some quibbling over whether or not it should define an unborn child as a child for the purposes of 529 accounts. But I do think that there's a lot of support for the idea that these accounts are really good for education policy for parents and families. And I think ultimately constituents need to weigh in with their senators, and I think put pressure on them to support this type of policy.
All right, David Christensen with the Family Research Council. Thanks for your time, sir.
Thank you for having me on.
The family-friendly independent streaming service VidAngel might find the answer it's looking for in a new bill in the U.S. House of Representatives. The streaming service, which allows families to filter content like adult language, nudity, and violence from movies, came under fire in 2016. 20th Century Fox, Disney, Lucasfilm, and Warner Brothers Studios filed copyright infringement and piracy lawsuits. The new bill updates a 2005 law by stating that streaming services like VidAngel are also approved filtering devices along with DVD players. Azusa Pacific University's board says it never approved a change in its code of conduct related to LGBTQ relationships on campus. Last week, the Christian University's administration reportedly changed its policy, which had banned public LGBTQ relationships on campus. The original wording has been reinstated. The board's statement about it contains 5 points, beginning with, quote, "We remain unequivocally biblical and orthodox in our evangelical Christian identity. The Bible serves as our anchor." Children attending a Bible camp were among those killed by the earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia. The country's disaster agency says more than 1,200 people have died following Friday's devastating tsunami that was triggered following a major earthquake. At least 34 children were killed when a mudslide buried the church where the camp was taking place. Coming up, how one Jewish man's move to return to his homeland of Israel resulted in a mass exodus of Soviet Jews. Welcome back. When Jewish people move to Israel from around the world, it's a joyful end to a long trip. One of the most famous stories is that of Natan Sharansky. CBN's Scott Ross sat down with him to talk about his immigration from Russia to Israel and how it resulted in the exodus of 2 million Soviet Jews.
Natan Sharansky has been connecting Jewish people to Israel for 50 years. There was a time, however, he didn't see anything good about his heritage.
I was born in 1948 in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine. We had nothing Jewish in our life. We were absolutely assimilated. No Jewish institutions existed, no Jewish culture, no synagogue. But there was one very Jewish thing in our life, and it was anti-Semitism. There was nothing positive in my being Jewish. There was only negative.
That changed in 1967 when Israel defeated the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the Six-Day War, reuniting Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty.
Here, Israel emerges victorious after the attempt of Arab countries to destroy it. And the Soviet Union made a lot of efforts to destroy Israel.
It also marked the time Sharansky and other Soviet Jews began their search for what it meant to be Jewish.
Everybody connects you to Israel and says you how your soldiers could do it. And you want to understand why for the world it is my soldiers. And that's when we started reading about ourselves, our history. And suddenly you discover that you have such a unique history, which starts not from this communist dictatorship, which starts from exodus from Egypt, and this desire to be free. And you discover that there is state of Israel, which is that you want to be part of it. That what gives you strength to start fighting for your right of a Jew to leave, to go to Israel.
Would the Soviet Union allow you to emigrate?
It was impossible. It was the regime who already killed tens of millions of citizens. So they would have no problem to kill another few hundred Jews, but we were lucky. Our struggle from the very first day became the struggle of all the Jews in the world, and with the time also of many non-Jews. And they succeeded to link all the interests of Soviet Union with the fate of Soviet Jews.
As an advocate for human rights and the Zionist movement, Sharansky also became known as a refusenik, a Jew who was refused permission to leave the Soviet Union and immigrate to Israel.
When they arrested me finally after a few years of my activities, they accused me in high treason and explained that I will not get out alive, I'll be sentenced to death, if I will not say publicly that they're right and we are wrong.
Sentenced to 14 years, he served 9, largely for spreading truth about human rights abuses in the Soviet Union. Now, I understand when you were in prison that one of the things that strengthened you was the Book of Psalms.
My Hebrew was not good enough, and I was reading, comparing different words, sentences. And it so happened that the first sentence which I understood fully was Psalm 23, and when I go through the valley of death, fear no evil because you are with me.
Were you a believer in God before this?
There is no physical explanation why you're ready to sacrifice your life if you don't understand that there are things which are much bigger than your physical survival. When I understood that I'm released, when they took away all the prison clothes, gave me civil clothes, and brought me to the airplane, so I was lying in the snow, refusing to move until they'll bring me back my psalm book.
You still have it?
It's always with me, yeah. It's always,
No, that's it?
Yeah, that's it.
Sharansky and his wife Avital were married one day before his arrest. She then led the charge for his release.
They crossed the border and the airplane from Israel took me. And that's how I met, after 12 years, my wife. And that's how I met all our Jewish people. So the day which started in Soviet KGB prison finished near the Kotel with thousands of our friends celebrating my release.
His struggle played a major role in the fall of the Iron Curtain, which opened the door for 2 million Jews to leave the Soviet Union. Years later, Sharansky headed the Jewish Agency, the organization that brings new immigrants to Israel.
So it is really the history of Exodus repeated itself in modern history.
Yes. When you hear your enemies threaten and they're going to push you into the sea and destroy the state of Israel, how do you respond to that?
We have to stand against all this hypocrisy, against all this hatred, and we rely on us, on our faith, on our God, and on our friends.
When you look back through the history and you see where Israel is now, how do you feel about your country?
God speaks to us by His doings. Right. Simply look what He's doing with Jewish people, and that's the best proof of His presence. What happened with Soviet Union? Soviet Union doesn't exist. See what happened with Israel. There is no country in the free world with such a successful, strong economy. And we brought so many Jews from so many different cultures, and how they all are becoming one people united with one vision. So that's the miracle.
Scott Ross for CBN in Jerusalem.
Still ahead, did you know you are living in a nation of criminals and just about everyone you know, and yourself included, are probably breaking the law and don't even know it? Did you know you might be breaking the law just going about your daily living? It's all because of unelected bureaucrats crafting rules that put unsuspecting citizens behind bars. In fact, as CBN's Jennifer Wishon reports, there are so many of these rules, hundreds of thousands of them, nobody has ever been able to get a handle on the exact number.
If you get out of bed today, there's a good chance you will commit a crime. There is no one in the United States over the age of 18 who cannot be indicted for some federal crime. That is not an exaggeration, says John Baker, a retired law professor from LSU.
Here at the Library of Congress, this is the Federal Criminal Code. Its pages hold some 5,000 criminal laws passed by Congress and signed by presidents. That's a lot, but it's only a drop in the bucket when you consider there are hundreds of thousands of federal regulations that carry criminal penalties.
I've seen the estimate of at least 300,000, it's probably more like 400 or 500,000 regulations that carry criminal penalties. For instance, it's literally a crime to misuse the Smokey the Bear logo or the Woodsy the Owl logo. It's a crime to write a check for under $1. It's a crime to label malt liquor pre-war strength.
Federal agencies are often given tremendous power by Congress to create regulations that carry criminal penalties and can drastically affect people's lives. Power that's been upheld by the Supreme Court.
Unelected bureaucrats are making regulations that can land you in jail.
Sure, and it's a huge number. We all have one thing in common, me included, which is at one time or another, we have probably violated some criminal regulation. We just don't know it, and we were lucky enough not to get caught and prosecuted.
So how does this happen? Political gridlock and lack of political will in Washington is actually empowering bureaucrats.
In order for members of Congress to get legislation passed to reach compromises while avoiding political pitfalls, they're often vague, leaving the details up to the agencies in charge of the subject matter.
There are so many of these regulations, no one knows how many there are, where they are, and of course these can include traps for the unwary, people who are going about their business, engaging in conduct that they would have had no idea violated any law, much less a criminal law, and they can get tripped up and possibly prosecuted for violating those laws.
And when the government has a hammer, Malcolm says, it tends to use it. This Twitter account tweets a federal crime each day. The project started in 2014 and will not be completed until the year 2848. That's a span of more than 800 years. And it's not just the federal government. State agencies write criminal regulations too.
Feeding the homeless is a crime in many places where people are doing it for a ministry.
John Whitehead, author of Battlefield America, has spent decades representing people in trouble with the law for simply exercising their constitutional rights.
We had a case in Arizona where a pastor wanted to have a Bible study in his home. The regulation, as I remember, was like for 10 people. He had 12 or 13. Some neighbors called. 7 policemen entered his home. He was finally arrested. He ended up serving 60 days in jail. This is for a Bible study. And he was put on house arrest after that with an electronic ankle bracelet.
Critics of federal agencies crafting criminal penalties say most of the time these violations could simply be handled with a fine. They're also skeptical many of the crimes aren't actions most people consider morally wrong. Instead, they're crimes because the government says they are, which is why so many people unwittingly break them.
If we end up criminalizing conduct that your average person would never have recognized was wrong, then people will all of a sudden lose respect for the rule of law.
By the way, did you know it's illegal to walk your dog on federal land on a leash that exceeds 6 feet?
How's the Constitution start? We the people. Whoa, think about that for a second. We the people, that means we're the government. The reason this is happening is because we're not taking action.
You say the change is going to have to trickle up from local governments.
I'm telling people, get down to that local city council, get these things changed. I mean, arresting a pastor 60 days in jail for having a Bible study with a few extra people in his home, is that a danger to society? Well, I don't think so.
It's all a contributing factor to the United States having the largest prison rate in the world. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News, Washington.
The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration that can be awarded to service members. President Trump presented the medal to former Army Staff Sergeant Ronald J. Schurer II for actions in Afghanistan back in 2008.
Ron was the only medic for the team. Roughly 200 well-trained and well-armed terrorists ambushed the American and Afghan forces. Soon Ron heard his comrade call his name. He was very, very seriously hurt. But Ron braved enemy fire to rush to his friend.
Scherer went on to fight through more gunfire to make his way up a mountain to treat and stabilize 4 more soldiers. We congratulate him and thank him and his family for their service. That is for sure. Well, you can find more of our exclusive coverage of the issues you care most about at cbnnews.com. And tell us what you think about the stories you've seen here. You can do that by emailing newswatch at cbn.com or talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hope you'll join us next time. Have a great day.